very fascinating presentations there. I'm sure you all have lots of questions. So I'd like to invite the speakers to join me at the front here and we can have some from you.
Can I just say something? I was so frightened of going over time. There's lots of things, of course, I didn't say. And what I didn't say is that in Turkey, there is no justice system, no justice system. It has a justice system which is unjust because it has no independent judiciary. Every single actor in the whole justice process, from the most junior policeman up to the prosecutors, the court ushers, the clerks, the people in the prison system, and then the judges, are all servants of the state. And you often wonder, when you go into court, you see the judge in the middle, the prosecutor sitting in the box, and then there, either side of him, there are the two other judges, and they always have their laptops up. I've seen that for the last 10 years, and they never say anything, they never seem to discuss, and I've come to the conclusion that they're playing solitaire. But this is really very, very important. The justice system as it is incapable of delivering, or for example, it's incapable therefore of even implementing the Copenhagen criteria, which were the conditions that in the law reform package that Turkey is obligated to in order to gain entry to the European Union. So in this whole thing, when we're talking about this peace process, we have to hope that somehow they will realize that they have to change the way that judges are trained, how you actually get access. I mean, it's very peculiar. It's the whole thing is political, the way the judges are chosen from when they are law students and they go into that judge school to become judges. And there's also whole lots of things in both the anti-terror law and in the constitution and the penal law that have to be changed. I've just mentioned now, and then you're supposed to be asking us questions, not me still speaking, but like Article 301. Article 301 in the penal law actually makes it a crime, an indictable crime, if you insult the Turkish state. Well, that is just open to every possible sort of fantasy. You see what we're up against. And then we're up against the anti-terror law, and as Desmond said, the anti-terror law, and unfortunately many European countries are also using the anti-terror law in their own countries to actually harass and persecute the Kurds. So this is a terrible way through the justice system that they can actually undertake a really cultural genocide. It is a genocide through repressing all freedom of speech, freedom of association, and non-violent political participation.
Thank you. Yes, I didn't get the chance to warn Margaret about my signs. I think they were a little bit startling. So, questions? Who'd like to start?
Yes. I want to ask Margaret in particular a question that's fine. I'm an anthropologist that was in Turkey 45 years ago, and I was studying unionism, and I encountered many people in the Turkish party and other people, and then I returned to Berkeley, which is where I was working, and there was a whole debate about Turkey being in the European Union, and many young Turkish graduate students said, well, this is a very important moral issue, we have to be in the, and I said, but actually the issues that are being raised against Turkey are the issues that deal with your own comrades. I mean, we're not talking about some abstract question. They're saying, what is the legal system like? And the people that they're suffering are the very people that are your own colleagues. They were making much the same issue that you raise now. Is it more important to say to Turkey, you can't be part of our community, but the Turks were telling me, no, see, it's discrimination against Muslim countries. It's more important for us to be a member. And we're talking about, this is not a question of are they legal irregularities. Everybody knows that. What is the important stance towards Turkey? Is it to say what you're doing is wrong, or is it to say, which the students said to me, no, we actually need to include you, because without your inclusion, there can be no advancement of Turkey. So I could never answer this question, and I've remembered it for 45 years.
I'd love to answer it. Very, very fine question, often being asked. As far as I'm concerned, and I mean, obviously, it's hugely divided in Turkey, and I may be wrong, but I think that the thing is shifting, and there's a whole lot of people within Turkey who actually now don't actually, and they're not that keen, they're not that involved in actually trying to show how they can comply with the obligations of the accession. And I, working as I do particularly on women's rights in Turkey, but on everybody's rights, I want Turkey to go on sitting at the table, not in until they really can comply with all the obligations of the European Convention on Human Rights. As long as we've got them sitting at the table, as long as we've got things like the Copenhagen criteria, as long as they've actually got that legal package, although, as I said earlier, they've never actually implemented it, but it is a way of somehow continuing to hold them to account in the public arena, internationally. I think if they were off the table, we would, a lot would be lost. So that's very, very important. And when we talk about all the areas, we haven't said it, and Desmond hasn't said it, and maybe more people later on today will, but one of the hugely important human rights violations which the Kurdish population is suffering, and I always want to be accepted as an honorary Kurd, because I really love the Kurds, and I long to learn the Kurdish language, and I long to speak the Kurdish language on the streets of Ankara and Istanbul one day. But the language rights are so fundamental to the actual identity, the cultural identity of the Kurdish people, and what they have done by actually banning the use of Kurdish in the schools and education is hugely, again, it is a cultural genocide. You realise that in many parts of, particularly in southeast Turkey, there isn't even any provision in the schools for learning Turkish as a second language. So you've got to be extraordinary, and there are wonderful examples of extraordinary successes that Kurdish children have made in going into schools and somehow overcoming the horrible barriers that are put to them because they're not allowed to use their Kurdish language. So that's terribly, terribly important. Your mother tongue. Imagine any of you here born in other countries, and I can see a lot of people born somewhere else, if you weren't allowed to use your mother tongue. What an incredible insult, an offence to your cultural upbringing, to your history that would be. So that's a very important one. And what happened in the trial on March the 26th in Istanbul was, it was the very, very first time, though, that they had passed a law just in time between the January trial and the March trial, when you were allowed to use the Kurdish language in court if you felt more comfortable with it. Somebody, one of the lawyers in that trial on March the 26th, he said, for 100 years I wanted to speak this language in court. It really brought tears to his eyes, and we all wanted to say, this is fantastic. But then, there were all sorts of odd things about that right to use the Kurdish language. You had to have an interpreter and a translator that you had to pay for. And and somebody said, and they wouldn't accept a translator or interpreter who was free. if he offered his services, because that would be political. And besides, even though they allowed that to happen, it then had to be translated into Turkish, but it hasn't really addressed the whole story of why the Kurdish language can't be used in education and in the schools. But that's an example of how that's really, really important as one of the many, many ingredients that they would have to comply with in order to join the European Union. And I mean, we know why even the United States has nothing to do with it, but why the United States is always pushing for Turkey to join the European Union, and so is the UK. But we know there are other reasons. I won't go on to it. I think we're all aware of why we want Turkey in the European Union. And if we really want Turkey in the European Union that much, for God's sake, let us really bring them to task about what they're doing to their Kurdish population. I hope that's answered your question.
In the ongoing negotiations now with Öcalan, is there enough inclusion of women groups, of other civil society groups, of other participants? And if this inclusion is not there, I think it's not working, but I think to you. If this inclusion is not there, can there be a peace for the Kurdish region if those groups are not included? Or is it just some kind of fake peace that is not sustainable and not positive? Maybe both of them can give their opinion.
I think, I'll say, but I think one of you would be a better answering than I. But can I just do an introduction to his question? No, there can't be a proper peace. Absolutely not, unless civil society organisations are consulted and are part of it. And I'm talking about women, but there'll be other civil society groups. Because when you've had a long conflict, and here we've had a 30-year conflict with literally thousands and thousands of people killed and thousands of people missing. Actually, it's a very good example if we think about the missing and about the needs of about the women who don't know what happened to their husbands or their fathers or their sons or their brothers. There's a whole lot of issues there which have to be resolved because the governments have never responded to the thousands and thousands of letters that have gone to the governments about what happened to my husband. And we're still finding mass graves. There are still mass graves still to be found. And then there's the whole question of the compensation of the people who lost all their homes and their livestock and everything when they were forcibly evicted from their mountain villages. There are huge problems where you are never going to get a peace unless you actually establishing some means of reconciliation and restorative justice, because you won't get a peace if those things are not addressed. And you will never get a real peace. I'm looking for my women here. We won't get a real peace unless you have real human rights and you have gender equality. We know that gender equality is essential to build a democratic society where the rule of law, where the rule of law exists and where there is real equality and human rights. But I think that, so I think that's very important, and I'm very worried about what is going on now with the two people sort of talking to each other and all these other things which are not part of it. But I think now that one of you would like to say something on that. Could you? Because you know much more about it than I do. I think you want to do that later. But anyway, so the answer is no. No. The lady says no.
Just a quick intervention. Sorry. from Tom Haddon. I was shipped out to Ankara in around about 2004-05 as a sort of sub for Kevin Boyle, who couldn't go. And I was supposed to be advising the European Commission on one of these packages of reforms. And it struck me that people like me going in as advisors, representatives of the European Union, couldn't speak Turkish, certainly couldn't speak Kurdish. We're having the wool pulled over our eyes by the officials. And one of the things that I tried to persuade the useful way forward was in some way to involve Turkish-speaking NGOs, Kurdish-speaking NGOs in reporting on the actual implementation on the ground of what was in these packages, because I had no clue, and I'm not sure that any of the other European people had much clue as to what was actually happening under these supposed packages. So just in terms of moving forward, I think if there is to be continuing Council of Europe or European Commission involvement, the European bodies must in some way incorporate into their review mechanisms people from Turkish, Kurdish NGOs who actually understand what is happening and who can report, and and that would mean some kind of guarantee from the European Commission, from the Council of Europe, of approved non-terrorist NGOs, and going with them to report on the implementation of what is actually happening. I tried to make those recommendations, but I was removed from the position when I made them.
Have we got time for a couple more questions if anyone has any? Okay, if not, would you just like to thank our speakers one more time? Thank you.